He was indoctrinated to slay without a flicker of hesitation, an unnamed phantom deployed by regimes to eliminate perils. But when his gaze intertwined with that of a child reciting the Qur'an, he lowered his firearm. Moments later, a drone obliterated the village. Only the child endured, still reciting, still fearless. And the man who had never placed faith in God couldn't stop trembling. He vanished. No trace, no assignment. Until one dawn, in a distant masjid, a man with tear-streaked eyes whispered the declaration, "Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah." This is not fiction, it's not a sermon, it's the authentic chronicle of the operative who discovered God, without ever being preached to. If you're ready to hear what made a hardened executioner collapse to his knees, press 1. They dispatched him to neutralize a man who wielded no weapons, only words. Victor had never botched a mission. A shadow within the system, he executed directives with robotic finesse. Invisible to the populace, unforgettable solely to the deceased. He left no trail. He bore no sorrow. He posed no questions. That was someone else's role. His was elimination. The mark was identified merely by a code name, the Scholar. No dossier photos, just satellite coordinates, voice print verifications, and a terse remark in the briefing. Potential religious radical. Influence expanding. It wasn't about the ideology, it was about the traction. Victor arrived in the eastern ridges of Afghanistan before first light. The village, a fragile cluster of sun-bleached clay dwellings nestled between serrated hills. Its people still slumbered under a bruised indigo sky. He ascended in silence, hugging a ridge that gave view to a stone courtyard shaded by a single gnarled olive tree. Through his scope, he spotted the Scholar, an elderly man in white, seated cross-legged, a miniature Qur'an in his lap. 7 children encircled him, some barefoot, one missing a sleeve. They weren't militant. They weren't chanting. They were listening. And he was reciting, steady and serene, his voice scarcely louder than the whispering wind. Victor zoomed in. He aligned the reticle. One breath, finger poised above the trigger. Then the unforeseen unfolded. A little girl pivoted her face toward him, though she couldn't have possibly perceived his presence, and smiled. She looked to the Scholar and softly echoed a verse he had just spoken. Ar-Rahman, Alam al-Qur'an, the most merciful, taught the Qur'an. Victor's finger froze. He had stared down countless targets, witnessed the terminal moments of men, women, even children, frozen through the glass lens of death. But this moment was alien. There was no terror, only tranquility. He blinked, disengaged from the scope, rubbed his face. Something in her voice didn't haunt him. It beckoned him. His earpiece crackled. "Victor, confirm shot. You're green. We've got satellite eyes." He stayed mute. "Victor, do you copy?" Still nothing. His grip slackened. The rifle dipped. He murmured, "I see children. I see serenity. This isn't the mission." Before the command center could react, the heavens thundered. A drone strike had been sanctioned, without his affirmation. The ground ruptured. Fire engulfed the olive tree. Smoke stabbed into the firmament. Dust surged up the hillside in a suffocating gray veil. Victor bolted down the ridge, through the chaos, into the remnants. Everything was obliterated. The pungency of scorched flesh saturated the air. Where life had once stirred, now debris, and then a voice, a fragile murmur. He stumbled over fractured stones, then found her, the same girl, somehow, alive. Her face cloaked in ash, lips murmuring in cadence. Fabi ayi alai rabikuma tukathiban. So which of your Lord's favors will you deny? Victor fell to his knees. The rifle tumbled from his hands. He didn't weep for the girl, nor the old man. He wept for the abyss within, fractured at last, because for the first time in his vocation, he encountered a target he couldn't extinguish and a query he couldn't silence. He disappeared, without a trace. No agents shadowed him through the mountains. No cameras caught his exit with falsified documents and a hollow gaze. By the time Victor reached Istanbul, he was no fugitive. He was a man who had forgotten who he was. The city swelled around him like a secret. The Adhan echoed through slender alleys. Ferries skimmed the Bosphorus. Pigeons burst from rooftops in chaotic harmony. It was the kind of place that allowed one to vanish, where no one asked where you came from, only where you were going. Victor had no answer. He rented a room above a falafel stall in the old quarter, paid in cash, gave no name, only a glance that told the landlord not to probe. The room was square, bare, silent. 4 walls, 1 window, and the Qur'an, inside his mind, on an endless loop. So which of your Lord's favors will you deny? He tried to muffle it with indulgences, noise, food, sleep. None penetrated deep enough. That verse, the one the girl had spoken, was now etched into his psyche. Not merely the words, but the way she had uttered them. Serene, unshaken, as though she knew something he didn't. He wandered the city at night. No maps, no agenda, just footsteps. He gravitated to the sea, where the sound of waves mirrored the stillness he had felt in those fleeting seconds before the inferno. He passed masjids, some grand, some modest, and always paused. He never stepped inside, but stood at the threshold, listening to the adhan reverberate through the colonnades, listening to Quranic verses drift into the street like sacred incense. He had been conditioned to distrust such sounds, to categorize them as radical influence. But they didn't sound radical. They sounded like they had been waiting for him. One night he stood before a dimly lit bookstore nestled beneath a weathered stone arch. A green and gold Qur'an gleamed in the display window, its cover catching moonlight. He gazed at it, then entered. The shopkeeper, elderly with glasses drooping down his nose, said nothing, just watched him with exhausted warmth. Victor remained mute. He pointed to an English translation on the shelf. The old man handed it to him, wordless. Back in his room, Victor placed the book on the floor. He stared at it, like it might indict him, like it knew. He didn't open it that night. Couldn't. He paced. Saturday stood, then finally knelt beside it. His hand hovered over the cover. Then, almost involuntarily, he opened it. The pages unfolded to a chapter, Al-Hadid, the Iron. His eyes locked on a verse that pierced his chest. Has the time not come for those who believe, for their hearts to humble to the remembrance of Allah? He dropped the book, staggered back. What was this? Coincidence? Guilt? Delusion? He didn't know. All he knew was, the question no longer came from a child in the rubble. It now rose from within. Victor no longer recognized himself. He had spent years erasing his identity, living under synthetic passports, donning nondescript uniforms. His body was trained to be lethal, disciplined. His mind honed into a cold, calculated device. Morality had no role in the institution that molded him, only results. But now, in a dim chamber above a falafel shop, silence thundered louder than any command ever issued. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and, worst of all, he couldn't forget. Not just the operation, not just the explosion, but the feeling that bloomed before the fire, that brief, sacred instant when he chose not to squeeze the trigger. It haunted him, not because it felt like failure, but because it felt right. The Qur'an lay open where he had dropped it, still on the same verse. Has the time not come? He couldn't close it. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Something about it felt like it was watching, not judging, just waiting. The next evening he picked it up again, turned to a random page, read a verse, closed it, then repeated the ritual. Again and again. He wasn't reading for data. He was reading for deliverance. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. He had buried guilt years ago beneath layers of emotional detachment, but the verses in this sacred book pierced something deeper, beyond his training, beyond his psychological armor, beyond the heavy silence he wore like a second skin. These lines spoke of mercy, of justice, of remorse and redemption. And suddenly, memories he had long exiled returned unbidden. A child clutching a blood-soaked toy, a man shielding his wife with his body, an elderly woman whispering prayers as he passed her home just before an ambush. These were not targets extracted from intelligence briefs. They were human beings, and now they had names. He tried to resist it, to reach for that old assassin's mindset like a muscle memory. Stay sharp, stay cold, stay numb. But it was too late. The emotions had come, not like whispers but like a deluge. First a trickle, then an unstoppable flood. He began to wander near a small masjid at the far end of a weathered street. He never went inside, only sat on a bench opposite the entrance during prayer hours. He watched the men take off their shoes, embrace one another with warmth, and step inside like they were returning home. Victor had never belonged anywhere, not since they had stripped him of his name, but something about that masjid stirred an ancient yearning in his chest, a longing he could not name. One evening, just after Maghrib prayer had concluded, an elderly man emerged from the masjid and saw Victor seated across the street. Offering a gentle nod, he said simply, without question or pressure, "Whenever you're ready, the door stays open." Victor didn't reply. He couldn't, but that night, back in his small room, he opened the prayer booklet the Imam had quietly slipped into his Qur'an during their first encounter. He began tracing the Arabic script with his fingertip, mouthing unfamiliar syllables, unsure of their pronunciation but somehow certain they carried sacred meaning. He rose, laid a towel on the floor, and attempted to mirror the motions of prayer as he had seen others perform. He bowed. He knelt. He pressed his forehead to the earth. And in that exposed, unfamiliar stillness, something inside him shattered. He didn't speak aloud, but in the hollow of his soul he whispered, "I don't know who you are, but if you see me, I'm here." He hadn't planned on entering, not that day. Victor had walked past that masjid dozens of times, morning, dusk, even in the dead of night when only his footsteps kept him company. He always slowed near the doorway, eyes brushing the carved wooden panels, the warm light seeping through windows, the gentle sound of Quranic recitation drifting on the breeze. But he never stepped inside. He wasn't ready. Or perhaps he was just afraid. In his former life, places like these were not sanctuaries. They were strategic sites, surveillance posts, targets. He had watched men enter and exit mosques, never questioning why they entered burdened and emerged illuminated. That had never mattered. Until now. That afternoon, something shifted. He was walking aimlessly, the Qur'an and the prayer booklet tucked under his arm, when the adhan began. The call wasn't loud or dramatic. It was soft and slow, like a voice coaxing him home. Victor stopped, looked up at the minaret, and, almost without thought, stepped inside. The air was different, not colder, not warmer, just still. The carpets were pristine. The faint aroma of oud lingered in the atmosphere. A few men stood in formation, heads bowed, shoulders touching. No one turned to stare. No one flinched. He hovered near the rear, unsure of where to place his shoes, his hands, his eyes. The Imam entered quietly and stood at the front. There was no spectacle, no fanfare, just peace. As the prayer commenced, Victor stood motionless. He didn't know the verses, he didn't understand the motions, but something within him was magnetized, not by the ritual, but by what it represented. He had knelt before, many times, but always from fatigue or camouflage, never from reverence. When the prayer ended, some of the congregants remained, reciting softly. Others lifted their palms in supplication. A few simply sat, utterly still, as though letting the tranquility settle in their bones. Victor didn't know whether to remain or walk out. Then a voice beside him broke the tension. "You don't have to know everything to begin," said the man gently. "You just have to begin." Victor turned. An elder stood beside him, bearded and wise, his eyes worn from years but glowing with serenity. He wasn't intimidating. He wasn't overly kind. He was simply present. "I've done things," Victor murmured. The man nodded. "So have we all. I don't know if I belong here." The imam smiled, a sadness buried behind the softness. "This masjid doesn't belong to perfect people. It belongs to the one who made broken ones." Victor looked down at the prayer rug. He hadn't brought one. Didn't know if he needed one. The imam reached into a nearby shelf and pulled out a small booklet, the same kind Victor had been struggling with in his room. "This can help," he said, "but not as much as your heart will." Victor took the booklet with both hands. Its edges were curled, its pages worn, a silent testimony to how many others had held it before him. That night he didn't open the Qur'an. He didn't need to. He already knew what it would say. Instead, he placed the booklet on the floor, removed his shoes, stood barefoot on the towel, and bowed, not from shame, not from fear, but from longing. He woke before dawn, not from an alarm but from something subtle stirring in his chest. The sky beyond his window was still cloaked in darkness. The streets hushed, the city draped in pre-Fajr stillness. It wasn't a silence of emptiness, it was a silence of presence, as though something awaited him. Victor sat on the edge of the bed, hands interlocked between his knees, staring at the floor. Beside him lay a folded white garment, the one the imam had offered the night before. It wasn't ornate, simple cotton, humble, but it felt like a robe spun from forgiveness. He hadn't worn white since childhood. He rose, barefoot, and walked to the modest sink in the corner of the room. The mirror above it was cracked along the edge, just enough to split his reflection. He stared at himself for a long while. Same eyes, same scars, same face, but not the same man. Not anymore. He turned on the tap and let the water run warm. This wasn't merely a bath, it was something far more profound. Ghusl, a sacred act of ritual purification. The imam had explained it with quiet dignity, the way one describes something revered. "You're not just rinsing grime from your skin," he had said. "You're washing away every voice that ever tried to convince you that you were beyond mercy." Victor began with his hands, then his forearms, his face, his scalp, his entire frame. He poured the water in slow, deliberate waves, not from caution, but because he wanted to experience it. Every droplet, every breath. As if the water itself was whispering to his soul what it meant to truly exist. When it was complete, he stood wrapped in a towel, drenched, purified not only in form, but in spirit. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a genesis. He robed himself in the white garment. No belt, no adornment, no insignia or weapon. Just stillness and simplicity. Outside, the adhan floated through the narrow alleyways like a gentle invitation from beyond the veils of this world. He followed it. The masjid's doors were already open, light spilling outward onto the ancient stone steps. Inside, a few men had already assembled, seated in serene anticipation. The imam stood near the front, offering a soft smile as Victor entered. No one stared. No one murmured. They simply made space. Victor joined the row. He stood shoulder to shoulder with men who had never witnessed what he had witnessed, who had never carried what he carried, and yet they welcomed him. Without interrogation, without reservation. He mimicked their motions, their posture, their poise, their devotion. When they bowed, he bowed. When they lowered to the floor, he followed. and when his forehead kissed the earth, he wept, not with sobs, not with gasping cries, but with a silence so heavy it soaked into the carpet like rainfall. It wasn't shame, it was surrender. When the prayer concluded, the imam turned to him. He didn't speak at once, just observed Victor as though gazing upon someone who had wandered for lifetimes. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Victor nodded. He raised his hands. His voice trembled as he recited the words, "I bear witness that there is no deity but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." No applause followed, no ovation, only stillness, only serenity. In that instant, Victor was no longer a former operative. He wasn't a fugitive, a dossier, or an instrument of control. He was a servant, and at last, a believer. But they hadn't forgotten him. The agency never did. Loose ends weren't tolerated. Victor had vanished from their grid months ago. But he knew better than to believe he had been erased from their archives. Men like him didn't simply vanish from a life built on shadows and silence. They were pursued, like ghosts who dared to become men again. The first sign emerged on a tram. He spotted the figure at the far end of the carriage. Still, facing forward, feigning disinterest. But it was the stance, the cadence, the gaze, not obvious to civilians but unmistakable to someone sculpted by espionage. It rang like thunder. Victor exited before his stop, turned right, then right again, slipped down a shadowed alley, melted into the crowd. He wasn't fleeing. He was reflecting. The dread wasn't in being apprehended. Not anymore. The true fear had been in remaining unchanged, and that fear was gone. He wandered down to the shore, where the sea moved with timeless rhythm without memory. The waves broke against the jagged rocks in a cadence that resembled dhikr, the remembrance of God. He sat upon a bench, opened his Qur'an, and let the wind flutter the pages until one anchored beneath his hand. They plot, and Allah plots, and Allah is the best of planners. He shut his eyes and smiled, not with pride but with stillness. Let them come. They would find no traitor, no insurgent, only a man who had relinquished his blade and embraced something infinitely more subversive to their world: truth. That evening he penned a letter, a farewell to the life that once owned his will. He didn't write for clemency or closure. He wrote so the man who had shaped him would know what finally broke him. "You told me I was born to comply. You said questions were flaws. You taught me to extinguish prayer with precision and silence faith with flame. But you never trained me for the moment the target looked back, with no fear. You never prepared me for the sound of a child's voice echoing louder than a drone. You forged me for destruction, but Allah rebuilt me for peace." He didn't sign it. There was no necessity. He sealed it, left it with a trusted soul, gave clear instructions. If I don't return, send it. The next morning, he visited the resting place of a man he had once been commanded to eliminate, a man labeled a threat. But in truth, he had only ever run a soup kitchen and recited verses on street corners. Victor stood long in silence, head bowed, palms open. He recited Al-Fatiha, slowly, reverently, word by sacred word, then whispered, "May Allah forgive you, and forgive me." The breeze drifted through the graveyard like a sacred hush. When he turned to leave, he did not glance back. Later that day, he returned to the masjid. One last time. He entered through the side door, took his place at the back. No declarations, no farewells. The imam saw him, said nothing, just offered a nod, the kind men give when a chapter ends and another begins. Victor placed the prayer booklet, creased, familiar, beloved, onto the shelf beside the others, smoothed its corners, then walked into the sunlight. If the agency came for him, they wouldn't recognize the man they once forged, because that man, the one designed to kill, vanish, and obey, no longer walked this earth. That file had been closed by the only sovereign that mattered. Victor was never seen in Istanbul again. No arrest, no report, no bullet, just disappearance. To the world that once molded him, he became a whisper, a thread left unpulled. Eventually, the agency ceased searching. But in a tranquil village along the Moroccan shoreline, far from satellites and suspicion, a man named Yasin taught orphans to read. He was soft-spoken, wore humble garments, walked to the masjid each dawn with a cane he didn't need but carried from habit. No one asked of his past. They knew him by presence, not by history. At the small madrasa behind the mosque, children gathered beneath an old olive tree to learn. They sat barefoot in the sand as Yasin traced letters into the earth. English alphabets in the morning, Arabic by noon, and between them, verses from the Qur'an, delivered with the kind of reverence that didn't need to shout, but settled. He rarely spoke about himself, and when he did, it was only to say, Allah brings people where they're meant to be. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk alone to the cliffs and sit beneath the stars, the sea groaning below him. He wouldn't pray aloud. He wouldn't cry. He would just listen, to the waves, to the silence, to the same wind that once carried the adhan through foreign streets. He no longer feared being found, because the man they wanted to find was gone. He had died the moment Victor dropped his rifle and picked up the Qur'an. Now only Yasin remained. One day, a boy from the class followed him after school, dirt on his face, worn slippers, a curious gleam in his eyes. "Stad," the boy asked, "were you always Muslim?" Yasin paused, smiled faintly, looked toward the horizon where the sea and sky blurred into each other. "No," he said softly, "but Islam was always waiting for me." The boy didn't understand fully, but he nodded anyway, as if some part of him felt the truth in it. Years passed like waves, quiet, endless, gentle. Yasin's beard grew white, his steps slowed, but his voice, when he recited Qur'an, still held the clarity of a man who had once heard it in the middle of fire. He was known in the village not for his past, but for his stillness. The way he would listen without interrupting, the way he made children feel seen, the way he paused before speaking, as if every word mattered. At the masjid, he never led the prayer. He preferred the second row, off to the side, hands folded, eyes downcast, lips moving with every verse. One morning, before Fajr, he unlocked the masjid as usual, placed his Qur'an at the front, swept the prayer hall slowly, then sat by the door and watched the sun rise behind the call to prayer. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His entire life had become a kind of prayer, a quiet submission, a second chance lived fully. Later that day, someone asked the imam why Yasin never gave khutbahs or lectures. The imam smiled and said, "Because some people don't need to speak anymore. Their silence says enough." And when the end finally came, peaceful, unnoticed, under the same olive tree where he taught every morning, it wasn't marked by headlines or history, just a closed Qur'an, a quiet masjid, and the echo of a voice long ago that had changed everything. So, which of your Lord's favors will you deny?